Do you want to harness the power of the observer? You've come to the right place. Hi, I'm MistRazor, and welcome back to Redstone from Zero, a tutorial series that teaches you Redstone from its foundations, assuming you come in knowing absolutely nothing about it. As usual, I recommend you start from episode 0 and watch in order, but I'll do my best to be comprehensible even if you haven't watched the previous episodes. Today, in episode 4, we're going to be talking about observers. What observers do is detect changes in block state, and when they observe a block state change, they emit a one-tick pulse. Some examples of changes in block state are a plant growing, a block getting pushed by a piston, dirt changing into mud, water changing to or from a bubble column, or a block getting placed or destroyed. And this is related, but not quite the same thing as the block updates we talked about in episode 2. We'll go into more detail when we cover block update detectors, or BUDs as they're often called, in a later episode. For now, if you imagine you're a Minecraft block, you can think of block updates as being about your neighbors, and block state changes as being about you. I'll use these stairs attached to an observer that outputs to a piston as an example of the difference between block updates and block state changes. When I place stairs next to them like this, a block update occurs. If I'd placed these stairs next to floating sand, that block update would have caused the sand to fall. But notice that even though a block update did happen, the observer didn't fire. That's because observers don't care about block updates. Now if I place the stairs next to the original stairs like this, a block update occurs, and a block state change occurs, which makes the observer fire, which we can see because it activated the piston and pushed the gravel up. The difference between the two scenarios is that in the latter scenario, the stairs being observed changed. In this case, they changed their shape, and that's what triggered the observer. Block state changes don't have to be visible, but in most cases they are. Some invisible block state changes are: leaves undergo a block state change when they change between being touched by wood and not being touched by wood. And redstone components like hoppers, droppers, and dispensers undergo a state change when they are powered or unpowered, despite not being visually different between states. For a complete listing of what observers can detect, I recommend going to minecraft.wiki/observer, since there are some differences between Java Edition and Bedrock Edition, and there are too many block states for me to give an exhaustive list in this video. So, observers only care about block state changes, and they only care about the block immediately in front of them. Wherever the face of the observer is pointing, that's the only block in the world they care about. Also, despite how they look, Minecraft considers observers to be a transparent block for redstone purposes. To prove it, see how the redstone dust isn't powered, but when the observer goes away and the gravel falls into place, now the redstone dust is powered. So don't try to send a redstone signal through an observer. The only redstone signal you can get out of them is the pulse that they generate themselves. Now consider for a moment that observers themselves have two block states that they change between. One where they're emitting a redstone pulse, which I'll call emit, and one where they're waiting to detect their next change, which I'll call await. It's not just cosmetic, these are real actual different block states in the observer. So what happens if two observers are pointing at each other? There are two possibilities. Imagine that both observers have been there looking at each other since the dawn of the universe. Neither was placed before the other, so neither has ever seen the other change. In that case, neither observer will emit any signals ever. This can actually happen when loading or unloading chunks and with block update suppression machines, but that's an advanced topic we can safely ignore for now. The other, much more common possibility, is that one of the observers was there first, which means that when the second observer was placed, the first observer noticed the block state change from empty block to observer in await state, and changed its own state to emit, as it emitted a one-tick pulse. Then the second observer, in await state, notices the first observer change to emit state. So during the next redstone tick, the second observer changes its state to emit. During the same tick, the first observer, having finished emitting, has changed its state back to await, but it sees the second observer change its state to emit. So during the second redstone tick after that, the first observer changes back to emit, which the second observer sees, and so on. This is a long, probably much too detailed way to say that when two observers are pointing at each other, they emit one-tick pulses every other redstone tick. So they're one of the fastest possible redstone clocks, and certainly one of the easiest to construct. In electronics terms, a clock is a circuit that emits a regular pulse, which other components use to synchronize their actions with each other, or just to perform an action repeatedly. For example, you could attach a redstone clock to a dispenser full of bone meal, and it would attempt to bone meal whatever was in front of it every time the clock pulsed. So, one thing to keep in mind is that observers only detect changes in block state. So if you point an observer at a line of redstone dust, and then power the redstone dust, the observer will emit a 1-tick pulse when the redstone dust becomes powered, and then it'll just sit there doing nothing after that until you eventually depower the redstone dust, at which point it will emit another 1-tick pulse. In electronics terms, something that detects when a circuit changes from on to off and off to on is called an edge detector. Here's why. Let's say we have some redstone dust that an observer is looking at. The dust starts out unpowered, then we power it for a while, then we unpower it. We can represent the power state of the redstone dust with a graph like this. When it's high, the redstone dust is powered, and when it's low, the redstone dust is unpowered. Then we can represent the power output of the observer with a graph like this. When it's high, the observer is emitting a 1-tick pulse, and when it's low, the observer isn't emitting any redstone signal. We can see that the observer is detecting the boundaries, the edges, between the different power states of the redstone dust. The first edge, the one where the redstone dust is going from unpowered to powered, we call a rising edge. And the second one, where the redstone dust is going from powered to unpowered, we call a falling edge. Observers are general edge detectors, in that they detect both rising and falling edges. So how could you construct just a rising edge detector? Actually, you've already seen a rising edge detector in the previous episode. I just didn't tell you that it was one at the time. In fact, the pulse shortener is also a rising edge detector. I'll show you why. When we power the redstone input, a blip of a signal gets through, a 1-tick pulse. That pulse coincides exactly with the input power level going from off to on, a rising edge. So it's detecting a rising edge. But unlike an observer, it doesn't send any signal through when the redstone input powers off, so it isn't a falling edge detector. And if we want to make a falling edge detector, it's as easy as using a redstone torch to invert the input to the rising edge detector. Note that you need to invert the input, not the output. After all, if you flip the signal graph upside down, what used to be a falling edge is now a rising edge, meaning the rising edge detector will detect it, meaning we converted the rising edge detector into a falling edge detector. The upshot of all of this is that observers detect both rising edges and falling edges. Another way of saying that is observers turn one long pulse into two short pulses, one at the beginning and one at the end. But what if the signal the observer is looking at is a 1-tick pulse itself? That's where things start to get interesting. If an observer is looking at a 1-tick pulse, it will emit on the rising edge. But because it's a 1-tick pulse, the rising edge happens during the same redstone tick as the falling edge. So instead of emitting two pulses, one for the rising edge and one for the falling edge, the observer will instead emit only a single 1-tick pulse. As it turns out, this is very, very useful. To see why, let's take a step back for a moment. I have 3 buttons, each connected to redstone dust. I want the corresponding redstone lamp to turn on when I press each button, but I don't want the other 2 lamps to turn on as well. I can't just do this, or all 3 lamps will turn on every time. I have to spread it out, like this, which is kind of annoying. I'd really like to be able to make things take less space, and have the redstone lines all right next to each other, but I can't because the redstone dust all interconnects and mixes all the signals together. In electronics terms, we call that crosstalk, when circuit A affects circuit B just because it's nearby and not because it's supposed to. Crosstalk is basically always bad, because if it were intended, we wouldn't call it crosstalk. But if I use observers and powered rails, I can put everything next to each other, while also eliminating crosstalk. The powered rails act like redstone dust, carrying the signal, and the observers act like redstone repeaters, strengthening and re-emitting the signal to keep it from getting too weak. The only downside to using observers and powered rails over redstone dust and repeaters is that observers and powered rails only work in terms of 1-tick pulses. If you send a signal longer than 1 tick, the first observer in the line will split it into 2 1-tick pulses because, remember, observers are edge detectors. And this is almost always not what you want, so you're limited to 1-tick pulses. So are we out of luck when it comes to using observers and powered rails to send longer signals from one circuit to another? Nope. Luckily, we have a tool that deals with that beautifully, as it turns out. Remember the T flip-flop from last episode? Here's a place where it shines. Because the T flip-flop takes input pulses and uses them to toggle a signal between on and off and stay that way until the next pulse it receives. Which is another way of saying, if you give a T flip-flop an input pulse, it creates a rising or falling edge. And if you create a rising edge on the first 1-tick pulse and create a falling edge on the second 1-tick pulse, then that means your signal starts out off, then is solidly on between the 2 pulses, then turns off again. Meaning, you can think of the T flip-flop as almost the opposite of an observer, because an observer transforms long redstone signals into short pulses, and a T flip-flop transforms pulses into long redstone signals. But if you're having trouble following what I'm saying, don't let my words confuse you. Just look at the graph. It should make what I'm getting at very clear. Which is that using a T flip-flop at the end of a chain of observers and powered rails will reproduce your original input signal. Also, as an aside, when the only input to a T flip-flop is an observer, we already know the signal will always be a one-tick pulse, meaning we don't even need to include the pulse shortener. We can just hook the sticky piston up to the observer's output directly. So what can we do with all this information about observers? One thing we can do is build a 7-segment display, also known as a digital number display. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. Mist, you've lost your mind. There's no way I can go from this to this. You're being that meme about how to draw an owl right now. But what if I told you you already know everything you need in order to build this? And don't worry, we'll go through it step by step. There are actually only 3 subcomponents to this machine, and once you understand how they work and how you need to attach them to each other, you'll be able to build a digital display just like this one. The first component is redstone and redstone lamps. Just a 1x3 or 3x1 column or row of redstone lamps attached to redstone dust. And basically, if you power the redstone dust, then it'll power this lamp, and then since these lamps are right next to it, they will also get powered by the center lamp. Just FYI, if we add another lamp on either side, they won't get powered. It's just the immediately adjacent redstone lamps that are going to get powered. And it also works in a vertical orientation. So that's the first component. Pretty simple, right? The second component is a T flip-flop, with an observer as an input and a sticky piston that pushes out the redstone block when the button first goes down, and then pulls it back when the button comes back up, because there's 2 state changes when this powers on, the observer sees it, and when this powers off, the observer sees it. So this is pretty much what we had over there. And then when we hook up this component to this component, we get this, where when the button goes down, the redstone lamp turns on, and when the button comes back up, the redstone lamps turn off. So still pretty simple, right? Just the redstone lamp component and the T flip-flop component. So for this component, we're going to be mainly looking at the propagation of redstone signals. So we press the button down, and the powered rail powers, the observer sees that, and sends out 1 pulse to power on the lamp, and then when it turns off, it sends another pulse to power on the lamp again. And looking at this, you can see that this component and this component are the same thing, pretty much. It's just a different configuration of the blocks, but it does the exact same thing. It's just that this one's looking at it, the rail from the front, and this one's looking at the rail from the side. So, no big deal. Goes on, and this blinks twice. This goes on, and this blinks twice. It does the same thing. So if we look at this one, we can see that we just took this part and moved it up, and put a rail in front of it, and then put that rail on top of another observer that's looking down here. So that way, this and this are pretty much the same thing. So we click this, and the redstone lamp blinks twice. Easy peasy. So now we're going to make it a little bit more complicated, but not actually that much. So basically we just took this one over here and made 2 of them. So there's one that's here and one that's here. And there's a glass block here just to show, it doesn't actually have to be a transparent block here, but the glass block is just to show that there's no observer looking at this rail in this spot. So for the blue line here, the observer's looking down at this rail. And it's the only rail that the blue line's looking at. And for the purple line, it's looking down at this rail. And this rail is the only line it's looking at. So when we press the first button, this lamp is going to turn on. And when we push the second button, this lamp is going to turn on. Or we'll call it the blue lamp and the purple lamp. So first button, blue lamp turns on. Second button, purple lamp turns on. Simple, just like that. Let's make it a little bit more complicated now, but not really. We basically added 1 more line here, and this line has an observer for the blue line and for the purple line. So when we press this one, the blue line only turns on. When we press this one, the purple line only turns on. But when we press this one, both of these will turn on. And it's really just a matter of wherever this blue line has an observer looking down, it's going to be turned on by the corresponding button. This is just a way to have one button turn on multiple lamps. Or basically to configure which lamps will be turned on by which buttons. It's simply a matter of where, if there's an observer there looking down, then this lamp will be turned on. It's as simple as that. So now we can see that this and this are the exact same thing too. We just took this part right here and moved it down to the ground. And so instead of the observers here looking down, the observers are now looking up into the rail. So when this gets powered, this observer sees that and triggers powering this rail, which this observer sees and turns on the blue lamp. So just like here, when we press the first button, the blue lamp turns on. Right here, when we press the first button, the blue lamp turns on. And when we press the second button, the purple lamp turns on. And just like over here, when we press the third button, both lamps turn on. Because both of these lines have an observer looking up for the third one. So don't overcomplicate it in your mind. It really is as simple as wherever there's an observer connecting the top rail here that's going this way to the bottom rail here that's going this way, that's where we're going to see a lamp turn on. Wherever we have an observer that's intersecting this rail with this rail, it means that this rail will power this lamp. So I know it looks kind of complicated and fancy, but it's really very simple. All right, so now that we know this component, we can combine all three components. We have the redstone dust with redstone lamps. We have the T flip-flop that's hooked up to an observer that's looking at rails. And then we have this signal encoder, which is what we call it. It's a signal encoder. So when we press this button here, it will light up this rail, right? And since the blue line is looking at this rail, the blue lamp will light up. Or specifically, because the blue line is looking at it, the signal will go up here, this observer will see it, it will trigger the T flip-flop, which will turn on the lamp. Which means when we press this first button, this turns on when the button goes down, and it turns off when the button comes back up. We'll see it again. And the same thing is happening on the second line, which is it's just happening to the purple instead of the blue. So when we press the second line, and it goes down, the lamp turns on. When it goes back up, the lamp turns off. And for the third line, it's going to trigger both the purple and the blue, because the purple line has an observer looking down at this rail, and the blue line has an observer looking down at this rail. So when we press this, both of the lamps light up. And that's it. That is what this is doing over here. This is just extended out. This is literally just to make it so it's easier to see the display when you press the button. But what it's doing is when this button goes down, they're sending a signal through. And on this first line, which is the 0 line for the number 0, it's activating the red, orange, yellow, green, not light blue, blue, and purple lines. And when we go over to here, we see red, orange, yellow, not light blue, green, blue, purple. So we come over here and we turn on the red, turn on the orange, turn on the yellow, turn on the green. Remember, there's no light blue. Turn on the blue and turn on the purple. And when we back up, it's the number 0, which corresponds to this line. So we can knock all these levers off, so that way we're not interfering with the workings of the circuit. Press the number 0 again, and that's where we get the 0. For the 1 line, it only needs to activate the yellow and the purple. And when we go look at this, we can see that it has an observer that's going to light up the yellow line and the purple line. And when we go and press it, that's exactly what happens. And we just wrote down what colors need to correspond to which number, and make sure that there's an observer looking up above that line, and then making sure that that line connects to the back of where that color is on the front. And that's all there is to it. This really is just this with more colors added to it and more numbers added to it. But if you can understand this, you can understand all of this, because it's the same thing. I know that it might still be intimidating, but you have everything you need to accomplish building this, and I encourage you to give it a try. I'm sure that you can do it. I believe in you. But before we end, let's go over what we talked about today. First, observers detect block state changes, not block updates. And remember, most block state changes are visible, but a few kinds aren't. 2. Despite their appearance, observers are a transparent block for redstone purposes. 3. 2 observers looking at each other will emit a 1-tick pulse every other redstone tick, a very fast clock. 4. When looking at redstone dust or powered rails, observers are edge detectors. They detect both rising edges, from unpowered to powered, and falling edges, from powered to unpowered. 5. An observer looking at a single 1-tick pulse will emit a single 1-tick pulse itself. This is because in a 1-tick pulse, the rising edge and the falling edge both occur during the same redstone tick. We can take advantage of that behavior to use powered rails and observers in place of redstone dust and repeaters. And if we attach a T flip-flop to the end of the chain of observers and powered rails, the T flip-flop's output will replicate the original input signal. 6. Observers don't have to be at the end of a powered rail for the aforementioned chaining to work. One powered rail line can trigger multiple observers at once, which can be useful if you want a single button or lever or pressure plate to activate multiple things at once. This is how the digital number display works. I know this is a longer video than usual, and the digital number display is still probably a bit intimidating to look at, so if there's something you don't understand, or if you just have a question, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain it to you. If you found this episode useful and think it deserves a like, I greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel. And with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!